Morning, everybody. How we doing today? I want to start real quick by saying thanks for everybody who's helped out, support the channel, and I still need donations to help keep this cafe alive. So those who are in a position to help, please send money through PayPal, Patreon, YouTube, thanks, whatever. We're just trying to keep this archive available for the public to come see. It's an important place that documents a large chunk of the American narrative. And not all Americans want to hear it through the lens that we put it, but it is the story that's being told, one of oppression and tyranny and overcoming that struggle through art. So if you value this channel and the things I share with you and the time I put into these episodes, if I lose this, I lose my home and my business, these episodes will also disappear. So if you value this, please help support this and help me keep this viable. And it's only going to happen with your donations. The locals just don't support me like I was hoping they would. But speaking of tyranny and oppression, we're going to talk today about one of the most tragic figures in this great art form. One born by the name of Eleanor Fagan, but known to the world as Billie Holiday. And it's taken me a while to compile this episode. I wanted to try to put her discography together in as linear a format as I could. And I didn't want to present it without having kind of my ducks in a row. It took me a while even to pull all of her stuff out because she records for a number of different labels over a number of different times, and stuff ended up getting bought out by other labels later down the road, so it shows up in different places in my shelves. So it took me a good few days to pull all these records out and then to try to sort through the lineage and chronology of everything and really getting a good grasp on it. But I think I'm ready to present it to you guys and tell you the narrative as we go along. Born April 7, 1915, Eleanor Fagan. If you look at the Wikipedia page, there's actually some confluence in terms of whether she was born in Philadelphia or Baltimore. I know she certainly spent time in both, but she certainly was raised in Baltimore and raised to young, unmarried black parents out of wedlock. Her struggle and the tyranny that she lived through and just the sad stories that unfold in this narrative are tear-jerking. There's some real ugly stuff that happens in this story. She dropped out of school at the age of 11, in and out of different housing situations, different parental roles. Father abandoned her at a young age. Her father was a jazz musician who ends up playing with Fletcher Henderson, and they kind of reconciled to some degree later on in Harlem down the road. But she ends up being raised by her mother and her mother-in-law. It's just a crazy story of her young child. She was raped at the age of 11. At the age of 12, she was working in a brothel. At one point, at the age of 9, she was being housed by some nuns in a reform school, and because she was acting unruly, they locked her into her room one night with a dead girl. You get to spend the night in this room with a carcass, with a dead girl. And apparently it left indelible haunting on her for the rest of her life. She would wake up screaming years later just from the memories of that haunting experience. And so from the series with the nuns and the parenting and the abusive, disappearing parenting acts and the dropping out of schools and being in the brothel and hearing the music of Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith, these Vice singers that were providing the music and the backdrop to the Vice dens in America. She was exposed at a young age to what the black American artists of like Bessie Smith and Louis Armstrong in particular, those two really triggered something in her. And she's known to have wrote at one point in her own one of her biographies or autobiographies that was Louis Armstrong's West End Blues that really impacted her in terms of rhythmic pronunciation and how to enunciate. And she always tried to sing like an instrument and was never professionally trained. She never had the education of music theory or knowledge. She just tried to sing like she heard the great players like the Lester Youngs and Louis Armstrongs, and and to enunciate and to perform like an instrument, which gave her a very unique approach that, while maybe not technically proficient, ends up becoming one of the real linchpins for many singers on down the road, including a one young Frank Sinatra, who I'll get back to later in this episode. She takes her name from the actress Billy Dove, who she was influenced by at a young age, and her father's name was Halliday, who professionally on stage used the name Holiday. So the Billie Holiday name was kind of the juxtaposition of those two names. And via Baltimore into Philadelphia, where her mother relocates. Her mother eventually relocates to Harlem, I believe in 1928 or 29. And Holiday eventually follows her mom up to Harlem. And she ends up getting gigs in some of the local Harlem clubs as a teenager, at the Alhambra and other places like that. And she's singing and already creating a bit of a niche and a bit of a buzz, but still very much an unknown commodity. And it was John Hammond, the great talent scout, who really heard her. And he showed up to hear a different singer, actually. And when she was there, he was kind of took by her. And it was Hammond that kind of puts her in touch with her first recording sessions with Benny Goodman in '33. And that quickly leads to her working with the great pianist Teddy Wilson. And Teddy Wilson is going to eventually have his own moment in the sun with Benny Goodman as well, a few years down the road. But it was with Teddy Wilson where she records a huge body of work, I think 95 songs. She worked with with Teddy Wilson throughout the 30s. And it's a very convoluted music industry in that time. We're talking the 78 RPM. She's recording early on for Vocalion and for Brunswick. And even the story of Brunswick's rather convoluted. It's an independent label. Eventually it falls into the hands of Columbia. Somehow Warner Brothers wrests it away because they weren't meeting certain distribution agreements. And Brunswick ends up being in the House of Decca later on. But at this point, Brunswick was an independent entity recording a young Billie Holiday with Teddy Wilson. And it's an interesting time. And she's really kind of finding her way. At that point, you sold 3,000 to 4,000 or 5,000 copies of your 78, which was pretty good for a race record. I mean, that was the real plateau. There wasn't a ton of expectation to sell a lot more than that. In '35, she works with Ellington briefly on the Symphony in Black, a rhapsody of Negro life, singing the song The Saddest Tale, playing the part of an abused woman, which for her probably wasn't a huge stretch. And it's one of the stories that kind of echoes throughout of her life, just this entire series of abusive relationships and violent men and alcohol-induced violence and just real tragedy. And so through Hammond, she starts making some inroads through Teddy Wilson and through obviously get Goodman briefly with a couple songs. And one of the Goodman songs actually sold relatively well. In '35 with Wilson, she had a pretty big hit with What a Little Moonlight Can Do and Miss Brown to You. And then in '35 she starts working with Vocalion Records, I Cried for You, sold 15,000 copies. And again, a successful 78 for a race record sold 3,000 to 4,000 copies. Because again, your distribution is going to be so vastly different than a Paul Whiteman or a Benny Goodman. Or, I mean, any of the great white singers of that day had the Dorsey brothers. They had very different distribution channels. The race records went to Harlem. They went to the south side of Chicago. They went to the black neighborhoods in Philadelphia and D.C. And so it was just a very different economic distribution that race records were really able to achieve. And so with Vocalion, she has that fairly decent success with I Cried for You. It's considered one of her early staple industry songs that's important. In 1934, Lester Young was boarding at her mother's home in Harlem. And it was listening to Lester, how he voiced and enunciated things that she said was a big influence on her. And Lester ended up christening her Lady Day. And she ended up calling him Prez. And both those nicknames really stuck and became huge parts of both those artists' legendary statuses, Lady Day and Prez. They were dear friends until the day they both passed away, months apart in 1959. So Lester actually lived with her mom, boarding for a while. And even the story with her mom and some of the instances with money and taking Billy's money and not ever giving a cent back, and just some real ugly stuff. And I guess the story of God Bless the Child comes from that, which we'll get to again later. In 1937 and 38, she starts working with Count Basie and Artie Shaw. And she's working with Basie, and she does songs like I Can't Get Started and They Can't Take That Away From Me. She enjoys working with Basie, but Basie said she was very unmanageable. The band had to kind of steer everything to work around her. She didn't take direction very well. They were playing kind of a stopgap tour of one-night stands in small clubs. It was rough. It was very rough. And she ends up getting fired from Basie's band. And the great singer, what was his name? Jimmy Rushing, I think it was, said she was very unprofessional and just very unmanageable. And so there's some different stories about why she got fired from Basie, but she ends up working with Artie Shaw later in 38. And that doesn't last long either, because as a black woman singing in a white Jewish orchestra, she was subject to all sorts of racism. And especially when they decided to tour the South, the Jim Crow South. There was an incident in, I think it was Lexington, Kentucky, I think I wrote it down, where one of the people in the audience called their N-word wench, singing their song, and just incredible disrespect and just protest, and Shaw tried to defend her the best that he could, but it was just heartbreaking and difficult for her, seeing the conditions in the South and seeing the treatment of her people and being in a white orchestra trying to make a difference. And people enjoyed her, but she was still less than being black in America in 1938. And it's just a real sad story. And finally, in November 38, she's in an elevator in the Lincoln Hotel in New York. And the customers in the hotel were complaining about her being in the elevator, and she was asked to take the service elevator. And Artie Shaw tearfully had to go and tell her that we would appreciate if you could not ride in the people elevator. And she ended up quitting and didn't really tour again. I mean, she does some stuff for the Jazz at the Philharmonic, but even there she doesn't do extensive road tours. She does go to Europe a few times later, but she really kind of avoided that experience from that point forward. It was just a really tough thing for her to witness. So it was while playing with Count Basie in 38, I believe it was. So it was with Basie in 38, I believe, that she was playing at the Savoy Ballroom opposite of Chick Webb and Ella Fitzgerald. And it was the battle of the ages, if you will. And across town that same night, Benny Goodman was playing his famous Carnegie shows. January 16, 1938 is when it was. And so the Webb Orchestra swung just so hard, and Ella was such a great dynamic singer. And Basie and his group had that simplistic driving swing that they did, and Billy singing. And I guess from most people's perspective, it was a pretty close draw. I think Metronome magazine gave the nod to Webb, and Downbeat voted that it was Basie. And by a 3-1 margin, Fitzgerald won that battle in-house that night. But while they were competitors, they ended up becoming pretty good friends, Ella and Billy. And they worked both for Norman Granz years later under the tutelage of the Clef Record, Verve Record umbrella. So it's really an interesting dynamic as we get into the late 30s, and she's really establishing herself, struggling with her personal demons, but still building her reputation as a singer. I'm going to try now to show you vinyl-wise. Again, this is going to be kind of a posthumous look at those 30s recordings, how they got repackaged in the LP era in the early 50s and even later. And most of what was on Vocalion, OK, and Brunswick ends up being owned by Columbia. So in the early 50s, it looks like 1949 even, this comes out. And this is Teddy Wilson, Billie Holiday, 10-inch. I mean, it almost looks like a 78, the way it's packaged and the flimsy paper. These recordings are from 35, 36. Legendary early Billy, Miss Brown to You, I Wished on the Moon, What a Little Moonlight Can Do, If You Were Mine. Like, these are the early standards we were talking about. Again, they were recorded for Brunswick. They were done on 78 RPM, but here they were issued by Columbia in 49, 60/40. So a pretty early 10-inch in the Columbia discography. And then also on Columbia, a few years later, Billie Holiday Favorites. Again, a 10-inch, number 61, 63. So that shows you how many 10 inches Columbia is putting out. Volumes of stuff compared to what some of the smaller labels were doing, where they had like 20, 30, 10 inches. Columbia had hundreds. And these songs are going to be more from the 40s, 40, 42, 47. I think some of the stuff was okay. Some of the stuff was Vocalion. Some of it might have still been Brunswick stuff. But it covers 37 to 42 mostly. Again, just compiled. And there was hundreds of songs from that era. So this is just a selection. It's a Sin to Tell a Lie, Swing Brothers Swing, Laughing at Life, Time on My Hands. There's one other 10-inch on Columbia that has another kind of less than this cover, kind of more like the early cover that comes in between, which I've not tracked down yet for a decent price. But this is 2 of her 3 Columbia 10 inches. And then this came out in the Party series, House Party, number 2531. And that 2500 sequence, the House Party sequence, was over 100 titles of kind of swing dance music meant for the young kids. I think these were slightly at a budget, discounted price. And she shares this here with Lena Horne and Ella Fitzgerald. So all 3 of them have some titles on there. But it's still a cool piece, and you see Billie. They probably didn't do a very good job picking a photo from that era, but it's still cool to see her Columbia work. And again, that recordings on there are all going to be from the 30s for the most part. She does record for Columbia up to like 42, I think. And then we get into the LP era. And this came out in 1956 on Columbia. Lady Day, classic collection of Billie Holiday. And these recordings were from 35 to 37. And again, it's going to be some of that same stuff that we saw on the 10 inches as well. Miss Brown to You, I Wished on the Moon, What a Little Moonlight Can Do, Summertime's on here, Billie's Blues. So again, standard stuff. Some of it's from her time with Teddy Wilson. But this is how Billie was coming available at that time, from 56, like I said. And at this point, she's well under contract with Norman Granz at the Clef label. But Columbia's reissuing her early material in this new format. So again, it's a convoluted thing here. And this is how, by the 70s now, this is a 2 LP set, the Billie Holiday Story, Volume 1, that's 33 to 39. And here's Volume 2, an awful cover if you ask me, 35 to 39 as well. And then Columbia has a Volume 3 in this series. This is 37 to 42. And so these 6 LPs, which of course 3 double LP sets, document a lot of that OK Vocalion Brunswick material. But so you can see that it's kind of convoluted getting this all straight. And then again in the 80s, they issue another series from that same era of recordings from 33 to 42. And so this is going to have some crossover from those double LP sets, from the 10-inch stuff. So there's a lot of duplicity, and it's kind of a convoluted thing to get your head around. Then here's God Bless the Child, which is also a compilation double record. Just a ton of great material on here. Also pretty much from that same era on Columbia. And so while some sides were recorded for Columbia, not a lot of it was. So that wraps up the first chapter. Let's move on to chapter 2. So in 1939, she stumbles upon this poem written by one Abel Meeropol, Strange Fruit. And it was a very charged poem written about lynchings in the South. And of course, that strange fruit hanging from southern trees was black bodies. It's a wrenching, harrowing song that will make your hair stand up on end. And Bille really struggled with singing it. This wasn't some picnic for her. Her father was refused medical treatment for a serious lung ailment and ended up dying from that lack of treatment in a purely racial, negligent sense. And so whenever she would sing this song, she couldn't help but think of her father. And it just would bring up all these feelings of racist hurt and pain and anger. And it was tough on her. But the audience loved it. It just really touched a nerve. And Columbia, the label, wouldn't touch it. They're like, we can't record that. That's just a little bit too poignant, a little bit too close to the hip. And so one Milt Gabler at the Commodore label decided that he would take that chance and record it. And the Commodore label under Gabler was a very forward-thinking label out of New York. I think it was a bookstore as well. There was a lot of social undercurrents percolating at Milt Gabler's Commodore Records and around that circle of people. And so they said, yeah, we'll record that. And they coupled it with the song Fine and Mellow. And Fine and Mellow became a big jukebox hit, with the B-side being, of course, Strange Fruit. And the song had a fairly impressive popularity. It was recorded in April 20 of 39. And it's just really one of the most important recordings of the pre-civil rights era. This isn't even the civil rights era. This is pre-war. This is testament to an ugly chapter in American history, and one we kind of gloss over. And so when you see this Commodore 10-inch, this would of course have been coming out in 53, 54, and it was calling together her 78 RPM Commodore recordings. So it was here with Milt Gabler that she got to record this first session in 39 with a couple of other songs, I think 6 songs, maybe 7 songs. And then in 44, she records some more stuff for Commodore and Gabler, and she actually re-records some of the songs she had done with Teddy Wilson back in the 30s, and has some pretty big success for Commodore with some of that material. Her mom opens up a restaurant. I think it was called Ma Holidays or something like that, but she's capitalizing on Bille's rising fame. And Bille ended up borrowing her mother a lot of money at this period. And when she went to go get some money from her mom, because she needed some herself, her mom refused her, wouldn't give her a cent. And then her response to that was to say, God bless the child that doesn't have their own, which she turned into a lyric and was co-wrote with someone. And it became one of her biggest selling songs in 1941, and it sold 1 million copies. And so that was a big hit, and that was for Columbia still. And so you see that in that God Bless the Child collection, which I just showed you, which is more later 39 or later 30s, early 40s recordings. So she's still at Columbia. She intermittently does record with Commodore at times. She returns to Commodore, like I said, in 44. And then in 42, right before the recording ban, a young label springs up in the West Coast called Capitol. And Paul Whiteman, the great white swing orchestra who played very kind of saccharine, light-hearted arrangements that didn't swing super hard, but sold pretty well. He was, by some, considered to be one of the early kings of swing, which from any perspective is kind of an insulting gesture. But he recorded with Billie Holiday under the name Lady Day because she was still under contract with Columbia. And she records the song Traveling Light. And it's a pop hit, number 23, and number one R&B hit, and 42 for Capitol Records. And then shortly after that, the recording band comes into play. And that puts a hiatus on recordings for 3 years in America. And so a lot of things kind of came to a complete halt. So when the recording band ends in 44, by this time Milt Gabler from Commodore has now become an A&R man for Decca Records, which was a label that was kind of affiliated with the United Kingdom, but had an American subsidiary. And by this time they'd actually kind of reacquired Brunswick in that kind of convoluted messing. And when she comes to Decca, she launches that career with the song Lover Man. And she insisted on adding strings. And they were a little hesitant at first, but when they showed up and the strings were there, she was ecstatic. And this is a kind of a poppier, show-tuney, it separates her from her earlier Teddy Wilson sides here. This is much more of a torch singer kind of a thing that she starts to do for Decca 44 through 1950 or so. And she has some pretty big successes for Decca in this period. Again, number 5 on the R&B charts, Lover Man, number 16 on the pop charts. And it's a time of some fairly big success for her, financially, but also a lot of chaos sets in. In 46, she's working on the film New Orleans with Louis Armstrong and Woody Herman, and racism and McCarthyism is rampant post-World War II. They are under heavy pressure to minimize the black portrayal of the influence of the African American on jazz. And so the producer Jules Levy and the writer Herbert Bieberman had to really reduce and edit, take things out and rewrite parts. And in spite of that, Herbert Bieberman still went to jail in 48, I believe it was, for being part of the Hollywood 10 as proponents of socialism and praising other minorities. It's amazing how ugly some of our American history is. A lot of Billie Holiday's work gets removed. And she was pretty disturbed by how many songs and how much of her performance was just taken out of the film. And how they didn't want to acknowledge Armstrong and Holiday and the influence of black Americans on this jazz music. Call New Orleans, for fuck's sake. It's like it couldn't be any more evident the importance of African Americans on this music. So again, she's feeling a sense of being jaded and really being denied. She sings Good Morning Heartache in 46, and she starts doing a real string of torch ballads in 46, 47. She made $250,000, 47, 46, 48, over the course of 3 years. Became one of the top selling artists of that torch song kind of thing. 46 and 47, she was voted Downbeat as the number 2 singer. So she's really reaching some critical acclaim and a pinnacle of success, some financial achievements. And then in 47 in May, she gets arrested for narcotics. And this narcotics arrest really changes her fortunes. The case of the United States versus Billie Holiday left an indelible mark on her. And she was never really the same post the trauma of that case. She said that during the process of that trial, the United States of America versus Billie Holiday, that's exactly how it felt. Like it was the United States versus Billie Holiday. And I think she was clearly targeted as a symbolic example. And we're going to really let people know that even as big a star as she is, we're going to throw the book at this woman. And racism was still such a rampant disease in the culture of this country. And again, we're still a decade some away from civil rights really entrenching itself and taking place. Her lawyer often wouldn't show up for court. I mean, think about how that would feel, how isolated and alone you would feel. And she was often sick from withdrawal, being on drugs and having to withdraw, going to court, couldn't hold food down, nauseous, sitting in that trial, just doubling over from illness, needing medical attention, having the nation attacking you, and not valuing any of what you've done. And she was eventually sentenced to Alderson Federal Prison in West Virginia, where she served a year or so and got out for good behavior. She lost her cabaret card, and her cabaret card was her license to earn. That means she couldn't perform anywhere where they served alcohol. And so, already not touring America because of the ugly that existed everywhere in America, now she can't perform in most of the clubs in New York. And it just led to hardships upon hardships. And when she got out of jail, she was convinced. So again, she gets out of jail from West Virginia in 47, 48, after serving around a year. And she's very sheepish to return to the spotlight after the People of America versus the United States versus Billie Holiday, how she feels about her place within the country, how she feels diminished by the racist propaganda agenda that had suppressed her, and had suppressed her in the film New Orleans. And they were really making her feel like an underprivileged member of society. And so when she was they were trying to talk her into doing the Carnegie Hall show in March 27, 1948, she was really hesitant to do it. She's like, I'm not sure people want to see the drug addict Billie Holiday anymore. But she kind of relinquished and chose to do it. And they sold out 2,700 tickets in advance, which was a record at that time. 3 curtain calls. And at one point, she had 3 curtain calls, and at which point she collapsed. And they had brought her out a box of gardenias, white gardenias, which was kind of one of her trademark things. And there was a hat pin in one of the flowers that she punctured her skull with, her head. And it was bleeding, and it was all over her face, and she didn't even notice until she collapsed after her 3rd curtain call. But the audience still loved her. She was still an unmistakable icon and an influencer, and was largely shaping the American singer of that era and all eras to come. Her interpretation of a vocal, her ability to inflect her own experience upon a vocal is really unrivaled. And of course, Armstrong kind of really sets that table. But it's just an amazing legacy of sorrow and sadness that seems to follow her. And for every happy highlight headline, there's 3 or 4 just devastating events that take place. She has a second arrest in San Francisco in January 22nd of 49 in the Hotel Mark Twain. And this is by George Hunter White, a Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent who has a spotted marked history. And there's some who think that he was looking for a headline. And obviously, if you're a federal narcotics agent and you're following around a jazz singer, you're obviously got some political and cultural, social motivations behind, because obviously she's not bringing the drugs in. She's obviously not a huge trafficker of these narcotics. She's a user and a victim of the illness, and not someone you should be funneling and spending federal taxpayer dollars targeting. And this guy has kind of a large legacy that's ugly in retrospect in some ways. So again, she's back in the eyes of the law, and again, she's back being the center of a lot of ill repute. In '49, she manages to have a big hit with Crazy He Calls Me, her second biggest Decca hit behind Lover Man. With very little radio support because of her publicity and because of who she was still doing relatively well. Decca was the first label to really give her royalties in the sense of how we understand that today. And by the time the '78 era comes along, goes away in the '50s, a lot of records fell out of print for a long time. And so in 1958, which we're jumping ahead a little bit there, she received $11 in royalties. I mean, so a song sung by most African Americans, though, there's a long litany of African American artists who were hijacked by the American recording industry, and it's always been an industry bereft of justice and equality and equal distribution of its earnings, and that goes the same for the R&B groups of the modern era and even a lot of the rock bands. There's a lot of exploitation by the powers that be. I want to real quick go through some more of the music from this time frame. This is the Commodore box set that Japan put out probably in the 80s or 90s, I'm guessing. And this covers, again, her Strange Fruit recordings from '39, and then she once again recorded for Commodore in '44. And this has alternate takes, and I think it's 3 record set. And it's a nice box set. It's comprehensive, again, with the alternate takes and all the kind of Japanese fonts you could ever want. But there is an English side to this as well, I believe, if I remember. Yeah. So it's a very good set to have, and it's always great to have her Commodore recordings. It's really hard kind of going through this and having to share a lot of the tyranny and oppression, and I mean, but it's the story that we live in America. This Billie Holiday, Teddy Wilson is on the mainstream label. If you look up there, it says Commodore Jazz Classics. It's a repackaging, again later, of the Commodore stuff here in America. Aside from like the Japanese big box set there, this would be some of that 10-inch material. And it was actually packaged again on Atlantic in the 70s here. Strange Fruit, Billie Holiday. And why Atlantic, how they licensed this and why, not really sure of the, but it is the same material and tells that same story of her Strange Fruit era, Colombian outline to touch it, Milt Gabler stepping into that gap. And then, of course, Gabler eventually brings her over to record at Decca, where he becomes an A&R guy. Here's a early Billie Holiday Decca 10-inch, which came out in '51. But it would be songs from 47, 48, 49, different 78 RPMs. Lover Man, of course, was like a big hit, like I said. Ellington's Solitude, We Loves You Porgy, You're My Thrill, Crazy He Calls Me. There's some great stuff on there. So this is from her Decca era, from the late 40s, once again called onto a 10-inch LP from the early 50s. Not that expensive, you can find that. And then LP era comes along 54, 55, and of course Decca once again reissues that material here on LP. The Lady Sings, Billie Holiday, This came out in 56, but again, it's Decca stuff from 44 to 50. And again, you have some of the same material, but other tracks as well. Easy Living's on here. What is this thing called? Love. She's doing a lot of recording for Decca and for Columbia and for Vocalion and for Eka. Here's another Decca LP, this one from 58. These recordings are mostly from 46 to 49. Keep on Running, Give Me a Pigfoot and a Bottle of Beer, Baby Get Lost. So again, not current recordings from this era, but still valuable holiday stuff to collect. And then here's Loverman, again reissued on Decca, and this is from 58 now. And this will have a lot of the same material as that 10-inch which I showed you, with some other material added to that as well. And so these 3 LPs seem to capture most of her Decca, at least a lot of her Decca stuff. And it is a more torchy, vocal, string influenced, kind of poppier side of what Bille was about. Here's the greatest hits that came out probably in the early 60s, maybe mid 60s. And again, it's going to be just more of those hits kind of culled together. Lover Man, Solitude, Easy Living, Crazy He Calls Me, God Bless the Child. So again, you're having Decca just kind of, and then once again, Billie Holiday's Story on Decca. And it's another nice collection of a lot of her 44, 47, 49, 47. I mean, so it's all of her 40s Decca stuff called together. So again, worthwhile to have, but it's a very saccharine but still wonderful side of Bille. So in 50, 51, 52, 53, there's a lot of drugs, there's a lot of drinking, there's a lot of abusive men, there's stories coming out, books coming out, a lot of narratives being shared. She's kind of in between here. She ends up being fairly broke at points in spite of having made good money at times. Her mother, again, has been an abusive agent as well. She ends up with a week-long engagement in Boston at the Storyville Club, which is the George Wein Club, who's famous for the Newport Jazz Festival of the 50s and 60s, which of course became his iconic promotion. And he kind of gives up the nightclub and works on these jazz festivals that were, of course, very huge events. And but while he still has a club in Boston, and there's some great stuff recorded at that club. A lot of it's on the Storyville label, some of it ends up on the Roost label, some great Stan Getz stuff at Storyville. So there's a lot of really iconic stuff that is recorded there. But in 52, when she has this 1 week engagement at Storyville, some of it gets recorded. And Nat Hentoff comes out and introduces her and tells a little narrative. And the Dale label, which is a really small label, issues this, Bille and Stan. And Stan Getz accompanies her, not on all the numbers, but on some of these numbers. Detour Ahead, which was actually an Aladdin recording. I think it was in 51, she ends up on Aladdin Records out on the West Coast very briefly. I think she records only 4 songs, and 2 of them are blues actually, which for someone who's considered one of the great blues singers, she wasn't really recording a lot of blues that are standard blues in that sense, but everything she sings has the blues pouring out of it. But Detour Ahead was one of the songs she actually recorded for Aladdin, which she documents here at Storyville. It's a Burt Goldblatt cover, which of course Goldblatt's all over jazz in this point of jazz. And this is not the best sounding recording. The vinyl itself's a little bit aged, but it's also a very expensive, very rare piece. And it's one of her most rare 50s era recordings. And I was happy to come across it. And it kind of took me a while to really understand where this fit in the timeline, but it is from that Storyville engagement. Another thing I saw said it was recorded in France, but I don't think that's actually true. I think it is just Storyville stuff. And it's a cool piece, definitely worth, if you ever stumble across it, definitely worth grabbing. And then the Storyville label, which goes out of business in the 56-7 era, gets relaunched in Denmark in the 80s. And here, the Danes reissue a full-length LP from that Storyville engagement from 28th of October to the 4th of November 1951 or 52. I think it was 51. Might have been 52. Can't remember. But so that's where this comes from. So again, not something that came out at that time. The Dale came out at that time, but this didn't. It came out in the 80s. And she's actually in pretty good form here. She's but it's a very convoluted discography. It's not like just writing down Hank Mobley's Blue Notes. It definitely takes some more discerning. In 54, she ends up in this Leonard Feather promotion in Europe. And she's on tour over there with this group, including Buddy DeFranco, Red Norvo, Sonny Clark, Beryl Booker, Jimmy Rainey, Red Mitchell, Carl Drinkard's in the group, Elaine Lighton. Quite an ensemble is over there playing in Germany and playing in Sweden and Switzerland. And that actually ends up having someone record one of the nights. And it shows up here, I believe in 64, on the United Artists label. This is from one of the nights in Germany, Berlin, I think it was, maybe Hamburg. I can't remember. But it's a concert in Germany, and you see Bille on the back. And documents an interesting time of her life. And she's kind of about to make a second resurgence. But again, she struggled with a lot of money issues and law issues and drug issues. There's books being written about her with various stories and tales and affairs and a lot of interesting tales, including one about her having an affair with Orson Welles right around the time he was working on Citizen Kane. I mean, it's just a convoluted tale that is half a nightmare, half a fantasy at times. It's really quite crazy. And then a very important chapter develops here. And going back to the 45, 46 Jazz of the Philharmonic, Norman Granz documents some Billie Holiday stuff. And she's not on a lot of the JATP tours, but she does show up. I think she was part of the 54 tour. But she ends up signing with Norman Granz and Clef Records in 52. And for some reason, some of the biographies and even the Wikipedia page really glosses over her Norman Granz era, which is astounding to me because it's outstanding stuff with outstanding bands. And certainly it doesn't have the revisionist oversight of the Columbia executives and even the people at Decca who can go back and populate those Wikipedia pages with all of the stories of her life, helping sell those eras of her discography. The Norman Granz era is a returning to her being a real jazz singer, a real jazz instrumentalist, having her voice be used in that purest of senses, and really highlights her in a wonderful setting with incredible musicians. And like I said, the Wikipedia biography on her really glosses over, it doesn't even mention Norman Granz, which is astounding because most of her body of work that's actual LPs being released in her lifetime, it's almost all from Norman Granz at Clef and Verve, which again, why would they not dive into that a little deeper? First recording for Norman Granz here was this 10-inch Clef number 118, 1952, which resurfaces as LP 690 on the Clef which they lost the great David Stone Martin artwork for that. But I mean, you have Ray Brown, Elvin Stoller, Barney Kessel, Charlie Shavers, Oscar Peterson, and Flip Phillips. I mean, it's hard not to make that kick ass. And she's fantastic here. She touches on some of her older material. These Foolish Things, Easy to Love, You Go to My Head, East of the Sun, Only Have Eyes for You, Solitude. Just a wonderful chapter in Holiday. And some of her finest recordings are clearly here from Norman Granz. Again, that's just the Verve 8074 repackaging of the Clef 690, which had the same cover, which was just this 10-inch. And there's a few other songs added to the LP that I've actually not been able to figure out where they come from. Probably could have dove a little deeper and figured that out. But then in 53 and 54, she has 2 more 10 inches for Norman Granz. And again, incredible lineups. Just wonderful, wonderful resurgence, and her with really empathetic players that really understand her. And these were repackaged as Clef 686, and then again as Verve 8027. So again, these come out first as 2 10 inches, 53, 54, and then as this LP on Clef and on Verve. And so you don't need to have all of them, but wonderful, wonderful Norman Granz led sessions. And then this is Bille at the Philharmonic, and it actually comes from a late 40s recording of her at the Philharmonic, and she's really in fine form, a great DSM cover. But when they went to reissue this on LP, they decided for some reason to attach it with this Ralph Burns Freeforms 10-inch, which was Clef 115. So really released a year or so before, maybe 2 years before this was released on 10-inch. But again, these recordings are from the late 40s. They get coupled together on this LP, Jazz Recital. Why they put Ralph Burns with the Billie Holiday Philharmonic stuff, not really sure. Maybe to sell the Ralph Burns, maybe they help sell each other to different audiences. It seems a weird coupling, to be honest. Why would you put these 2 10 inches together and lose the DSM artwork for that repackaging? But that's what they did. And so we're actually listening now to this. Body and soul, baby. She's just a marvelous, marvelous talent. And now this gets us into the real body of her work as LPs for Norman Granz. And this is from 56. This still had a Clef reissuing as Clef 669, so there was no 10-inch here. It was Clef 669, and the Clef label continues into 57 or 58, but the Verve label is already in place. And so the Verve repackaging probably was almost synonymous with the Clef issuing of it. And it was issued as Verve 8026 and also as a Verve 5260. Again, you have Benny Carter, Harry Sweets Edison, Barney Kessel, Jimmy Rawls, John Simmons, Larry Bunker. Just incredible groupings of musicians behind her here. And then 56 as well, Velvet Moods by Billie Holiday. Again, not a very traditional Holiday cover. Edison, Carter, Kessel, Rawls, Simmons, Bunker. Again, pretty much the same, possibly from the same sessions. And then in 56, Lady Sings the Blues was issued. And this has Harry Edison, Charlie Shavers, Willie Smith, Barney Kessel, Kenny Burrell's on some of this, Bobby Tucker, Wynton Kelly, Chico Hamilton, Lenny McBrown, some West Coast players are Red Callender, Tony Scott. So it's kind of a bit of a different lineup there, actually. But a lot of West Coast guys there. And she, again, there was books coming out, Lady Singing the Blues. She once again, around this time, plays Carnegie Hall. Again, to quite big fanfare. an interesting resurgence for her, and this is a documentation of her Carnegie Hall performance from the 55 or 56 concert. This didn't come out till like 61 on Verve 8410, but it's from this era. In 57, she does songs for Distinguished Lovers, Billie Holiday, Harry Edison, Ben Webster, Jimmy Rawls, Barney Kessel, Red Mitchell, Alvin Stoller, and Joe Monaghan's on some of it. Larry Bunker's on a couple tracks as well. So again, now you're straight into Verve release 8257 here, 1957. But again, she is diminishing. Let's be clear. But day in, day out, Foggy Day, Stars Fall in Alabama. I mean, I love her in these settings with these groups. She's really phenomenal. Body and Soul in 1957 once again with Sweets, Webster, Rawls, Kessel, Bunker. Body and Soul 81-97. So in this era, CBS does a special called The Sound of Jazz on television. And Bille's part of it along with Lester Young. And their years-long relationship really gets one more dance in the spotlight. And they kind of are just nodding to each other and just really inflecting and accenting each other. It's a beautiful moment in jazz. And both of them pass away 2 years later within months of each other. But it's definitely a highlight moment in a waning of a great career and a great life. And she just dies so much younger than she really should have. In the summer of 57 in Central Park, there was a series called Jazz Under the Stars of concerts in the park, along with Dinah Washington and other artists as well, and she was part of that. And she's recognized, but still, it's still America, and she's still a black woman. You know what I mean? This is from Newport. I believe it's from 57 as well. Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday both performing. And I'm not sure who the group is on this, but Personnel, Mal Waldron, Joe Benjamin, and Joe Jones on the drums. Interesting. You don't think of Mal Waldron playing with Billie Holiday, but there he is. So interesting stuff. And this comes out in 58, and her contract's actually expired at this point with Verve. But they have some stuff in the vaults, and this has Bud Johnson, Charlie Shavers, Billy Bauer, Herb Ellis, Oscar Peterson, Ray Brown, Stay With Me. Some wonderful versions I hear, Wished on the Moon, Ain't Misbehaving, the great Fats Waller song. Just great stuff. Billy Taylor's on some of this as well. Cozy Cole. And then what I believe is her last Verve record. This is from 8329, 1958. Sweets, Webster, Rawls, Kessel, Mitchell, and Mondragon as well. All or Nothing at All. And again, she's already been re-signed by Columbia at this point. But again, she's been greatly diminished in health, and her strength and energy is really not what it once was. And in 58, she records this record under the tutelage of Ray Ellis, who leads an orchestra of a 40-piece band, Lady in Satin. And again, she's greatly weakened. It was recorded in February of 58, released in June of the same year. And I mean, it's not as great as her Norman Granz recordings. It's a long way from her early Teddy Wilson fantastic stuff. But it's still a noteworthy and a record worth having in your collection. And then later the next year, she records the Save for Ray Ellis again, which ends up being her last recording memorial album. You see how they put that sticker on their memorial. It's because she passes in the summer of this year. This was from March of 59. And again, the Ray Ellis Orchestra kind of backs her on these numbers. And she's greatly diminished at this point, sadly. And then there's a couple more Verve collections here that are just, you know, tracks from those records I just showed you. But her Verve Clef Canon is great stuff, yet it's really kind of glossed over in some of the archives where they talk about her history, which I don't really understand, because I mean the lineups that Norman Granz gave her to work with is top of the mark stuff. It's a sad ending. By July 15, cirrhosis of the liver leading to heart failure, she passes away and she's pronounced dead. And Lester passed shortly around that same time. And they say when she died, she had 70 cents in the bank. And I mean, in some way, that's the story of the black artist in America. It's a sad story. It's hard not to tear up at times. Being put in a room by nuns with a dead girl, locked in a room, being raped at 11, the parental turmoil that she was subjected to, the alcohol, the abuse of men, the drug addictions, the court cases with lawyers not showing up and the country just coming down on her, and having still recorded one of the greatest bodies of work and being one of the greatest singers of all time. And I'm going to close this episode by saying Sinatra, around the time of her passing, gave her recognition as one of the greatest single influences on his career, and saying that she was one of the single most important singers in the American history. Sinatra, who doesn't really sing with a ton of holiday in his sound, but he recognized and was so influenced by her. And holiday is just such an important element of the American pop vernacular. She deserves so much recognition and so much praise and adulation. And so I hope you all enjoyed that episode. It's a bit long, but I did want to put it all together, let people see her body of work from that early vocale and Brunswick OK stuff, the Columbia era, the stuff that she did for Commodore, and then how she goes to Decca, and how her song kind of changes in that era. And then just the fantastic return with the Norman Granz stuff that's really on par with anything anyone's ever done. And I just, in my heart, I just love her story. It's just a touching story that needs to be shared and retold, and her remembrance should be held in the highest esteem. She's truly one of the greatest of all time. And we'd be remiss to not recognize and really heap praise on this pained woman. This woman who was raised in brothels, cleaning marble stairs for the elite, picking up breadcrumbs, trying to make a living, just tossed between the not give a shit pile and the discard pile. It's really a sad story that it moves me to hear it and to read it and to research it. And you can hear it come through her voice when she enunciates songs and inflects and changes the meaning of songs with just simple syllables. It's a very unique skill set that she had a real knack for. And I enjoyed pulling this together. It's a huge body of work. It took me a long time to kind of pull all this stuff out. So I hope you all enjoyed that and I hope you all appreciated that. Please help support the channel. And let's just, in the comments, let me know what your favorite Billie Holiday era is, what your favorite Billie Holiday song is. And heaven help those who don't love Billie Holiday, because she's such a noble figure. And many of us would have crumbled much earlier to the things that she faced. I'll be honest, it stirred my heart at times. It really was a difficult narrative to tell at times, but it certainly needs to be told. So I hope you all enjoyed that. My name is Dan. Appreciate you all again. Please help support the channel. Please support us financially if you can. If you want to see this type of content continue to be on YouTube, I need this venue. I need this place. I need my home. God forbid I lose it. I might lose my records and everything else with it. So y'all be blessed. Have a great day. We'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.